Okay, welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us for this book talk. My name is Asad Ahmed. I am Professor of Arabic and Islamic Studies and the Chair of the Center for Middle Eastern Studies. I want to thank all of you for joining us and our speaker today, Dr. Leyla Ozgur Alhassen. I'm going to begin by introducing our speaker, and then let me also lay out the basic rules of how we will conduct this. During the lecture, please write your questions and comments in the chat window. I'm your moderator. You can write them during the talk as thoughts occur to you or afterwards, and I will filter them to our speaker at the end of the talk. The talk would be about 40 to 50 minutes, give or take, and then there will be some questions and answers. So let me begin with an introduction. Dr. Leyla Ozgur Alhassen is a Quranic studies scholar. She is the author of Quranic Stories, God, Revelation, and the Audience. Her scholarship revolves around Quranic stories, style and interpretation in literature, performance, and art across historical periods, languages, and disciplinary boundaries. She is the author of a forthcoming book, Repetition in Quranic Studies, which will be published by Oxford University Press, and is also working on a book on hierarchies of beings in the Qur'an. Dr. Alhassen is the author of a number of important articles, including a narratological analysis of the story of Ibrahim in the Qur'an, faith, family, parents, and ancestors, of Islam and iconoclasm, Ibrahim and the destruction of idols in the Quran, an article with the title You Are Not There, the creation of humility and knowledge in Quranic stories, a rhetorical and narratological analysis, and so on. Today, she will be giving a lecture related to her book, Quranic Stories, that I just mentioned, published by Edinburgh University Press. And she is a recipient of a PhD from the University of California, Los Angeles in Near Eastern languages and cultures. So Dr. Alhassen, thank you so much for agreeing to give this lecture for us. And now I pass the platform to you.
Thank you. It's great to be here. I'm going to share my screen. There we go. Okay, so thank you for joining me on this journey. I was thinking it's really a journey through Quranic stories. It's a journey through the text. And the word journey gets at my approach to the Quran, which is as an interaction. It's an interaction between God, the text itself, and the audience. And I'll get into that more. What brought me to this research? So I actually have a literature background, and I've always loved stories. So, and I was also interested in the Quran itself. And when I started doing my research on Quranic stories, I found that a lot of what was out there was historical or comparative or both. And there wasn't as much looking at how the stories actually work. What is going on with the stories? Why is a dialogue portrayed the way it is? Why are certain phrases repeated or not repeated? How are characters portrayed? Those kinds of questions. I also started reading from Robert Alter and Mike Ball on the Bible. And I am not an expert on the Bible, and my work is not comparative, but what I was inspired by their approaches and I wanted to bring some of that to the Quran. Quranic stories are found throughout the Quran. There are very few stories that are told in only one place in the Quran. Most of them are told in bits and pieces throughout the Quran. Why do they matter? That's in a way what we're going to get to, but my main argument is that they reinforce theological beliefs that the Quran discusses in non-narrative. My book itself goes through different surahs and the stories in them. So I have Surat Al-Imran and Surat Maryam that basically go through, well, Surat Al-Imran has the story of Maryam's mother, and then they both also have the stories of Maryam, Zakaria, and Isa. There's also Surat Yusuf, and then which goes through the story of Yusuf, and then Surat Taha and Surat Al-Qasas, which both go through the stories of Musa and Harun and Fir'aun as well. Main contributions of my book, the first is one I've already mentioned, that Quranic narrative style fulfills theological purposes. So there's an interaction between the style and content. I also, like I said, and as the title indicates, I look at the interaction of the audience, the text, God, and characters. I also always have in mind the oral nature of the text. The Quran was revealed orally, was passed on orally, and with some notation, but there's rhyme, there's rhythm, there's echoing phrases, which all come from also it's being a Semitic language. So, and it utilizes that. So you'll find, a phrase or a word that's repeated multiple times in a story, and then in the surah that the story is found in. So my analysis looks at things like that too. We can also look at and think about the text as a layered text, almost like an orchestra. And that analogy comes from Naveen Reda, which I like. The Quran is an intertextual text. Verses connect, comment on, and complicate each other. The Quran rewards a semantic analysis. And here my semantic analysis is really inspired by Toshihiko Izutsu. And what he does, he'll look at one root in the whole Quran. I don't usually look in the whole Quran. I'll look in a story or in the surah that the story is also found in. And I mean, you'll find so much nuance when you do that. There's the idea, for example, of inheritance in the story of Zakaria, but then that changes throughout the surah itself, and it becomes more complicated than how he started. We see also through this research the benefits of a comprehensive analysis, and that goes hand in hand with the semantic analysis. So if I were interested in Zakaria and inheritance, what does he mean by inheritance? I really would be best off if I look at other uses of that same root in the same surah. Stories and non-stories are connected to each other. I think in a lot of scholarship, we look at them in a disconnected way, but they're not disconnected. They are in fact connected. I also work with tafsir, and I think about it as a living tradition. I think of it as one way to talk about it would be reader response. It's like a record of how other readers responded to the text. It's also, if we go back to the analogy of a journey, it's like we have a written record of other people's journeys with the Quran, how they responded to it, the questions it made them think about, and how they answered those questions. Another contribution from my work is looking at the Quran through the idea of layers of narration. So here we have these circles. If you look at the outermost circle, you can think about narrative discourse. God as narrator to the audience. So the Quran itself, it addresses its audience, and its audience, there are different audiences that are addressed. And that's how basically a believing reader would look at the Quran, is that it's God's word to us. Within that circle, we see God as narrator to Prophet Muhammad. So here is, I mean, again, this is the belief of Muslims, but also the way that the Quran talks. So sometimes, like as Asad read in my bio, I have an article called "You Were Not There." So there are some verses that address you singular, and those are often interpreted as being addressed to Muhammad himself. And then the innermost layer we can think about is the story itself, if there's a story. So, and in the stories, we see God as a character interacting with and talking to other characters. Future directions for research. So as we mentioned, I mean, when I started my work on Quranic stories, it became clear that repetition is something that I would also want to explore. Also, I'm looking into hierarchies of beings or anthropocentrism through Quranic stories. And here underlying this is my argument that Quranic stories can help solve theological problems, or can, I mean, they talk to those issues too. Narrative, structure, echoes can all be ways to answer specific questions that we have when we read the text. So today I thought I would discuss specifically the story of Musa in Surat Taha. And when you look comprehensively at the story of Musa in the Quran, you find Musa and Fir'aun in 24 stories, Musa and the book, 10 stories, Musa and his people, 7 stories, Musa and the wise man is 1 story. Another way to look at this is, so if we take that first branch from here, Musa and Fir'aun, and then we see repetition basically there. So for example, in the stories of Musa and Fir'aun in the Quran, we have an introduction very many times. We have Fir'aun's sins mentioned a few times. God sent Musa to the oppressed. Musa sees a fire, etc. Okay, so now I thought I would actually, do a close reading with some of my favorite parts from Surat Taha. And what we're looking at here is what I'm calling merging words and making connections in Surat Taha. The story of Musa is the most frequently mentioned story in the Quran. Surat Taha includes the story of Musa at length. The surah begins with an introduction. The majority of the surah is taken up with the story of Musa, and it also includes a short telling of the story of Adam and a discussion of Judgment Day. My analysis today will focus on the story of Musa in Surat Taha. Surat Taha includes God in at least 3 ways. God as a character in the story, God as the narrator of the story, and also God as the implied author of the story. For a pious reader who believes that God is the implied author of the story, that the Quran is the word of God, this is also a historical claim. To this role, we might also add God's role as creator of the readers in the world outside of the surah. God, the narrator, is omniscient and reliable. However, God sometimes withholds information from the audience. God is thus an infinitely reliable narrator who reserves the right to hold back. By withholding information and using other subtle techniques, narrative techniques, God, the narrator, makes his readers. As literary analyst Wayne Booth mentions, an author makes his readers by forcing them onto a level of alertness that will allow for his most subtle effects. Booth elucidates the concept of how an author can make his readers, and that discussion is especially important for us today. He writes, quote, The author makes his readers. If he makes them badly, that is, if he simply waits in all purity for the occasional reader whose perceptions and norms happen to match his own, then his conception must be lofty indeed, if we are to forgive him for his bad craftsmanship. But if he makes them well, that is, makes them see what they have never seen before, moves them into a new order of perception and experience altogether, he finds his reward in the peers he has created. The way to make readers well is to shape their perceptions and the norms of the reader, making them see what they have never seen before. This concept perfectly melds God as creator and God as narrator. God literally makes readers and gives them new perceptions and experiences from an Islamic theological perspective, and God makes readers by making them see new things through the narrative style of the Qur'an. Today, I will explore ways in which the narrator creates and develops consonants through connections between characters, connections with the audience, and connections between various parts of the Quranic text. The creation of consonants is a phrase that I developed in order to discuss the Quranic narrative strategy of the building of a relationship between various elements of the text: God, revelation, and the audience. The word creating brings to mind the creator, who is the Quranic narrator and author. This in and of itself argues that the Quranic style goes hand in hand with the beliefs about God that it emphasizes. We repeatedly see the narrator confirming and merging people's words in Surat Taha. The method of analysis in this talk today works with these prominent elements of the narrative style in the surah. I will discuss examples of creating consonants through the narrator confirming people's words. I examine how the creator develops the relationship between God as character and other characters in the text. This is by confirming people's words, by showing what they said in dialogue to be true in narration. In this section, I develop a new explication for a Quranic narrative technique, merging words. There are a few examples of merging words where the dialogue merges with the narration so that the words of a character merge into God's words. I will show how this confirms the character's words and goodness. They speak such truth that even God speaks with them. Narrative choices thus work to further beliefs about God and people's relationships with God. It might not surprise us that God, the narrator, confirms the words of God, the character, in the text. While not surprising, we clearly see the narrator shaping the perceptions of the reader in this way. God does exactly what God says and does so promptly. This goes hand in hand with the theological belief in God's omnipotence and omniscience. What may surprise us is when God, the narrator, confirms people's words through the narrative. The narrator even does this by merging characters' speeches with God's speech. The implication here for beliefs about God's nature is that God can do anything he wills, and he may desire to assert people's words, especially if these people are close to God or doing God's will. At the same time, we can look at these moments as connections being formed between God and the characters. The first example I'll focus on comes at the beginning of Surat Taha. So we actually go to verse 10. Musa's story begins when he notices a fire and is drawn to it. He saw a fire and said to his people, "Stay here, I can see a fire. Maybe I can bring you a flaming brand from it or find some guidance there." Musa mentions the possibility of finding guidance at the fire. And he does. He finds more than just physical guidance. He finds spiritual guidance there when God summons him, verse 11. inspires and guides him, verses 13 to 23, and commands him to go to Fir'aun, is verse 24. Sufi commentator Al-Maybudi reflects, fire is a mark of munificence and a proof of generosity. The Arabs would light up a fire to bring guests, but no one has ever found a banquet through a fire like Moses, and no one has seen a host from a fire like God. Moses was seeking a fire to light up a tent. He found a fire that burns spirit and heart. Maybudi here remarks on the spiritual connection that Musa finds and the loving relationship with God. There are hints of this when Musa mentions the fire that he sees in verse 10, using a word that comes from the root word for intimacy, anestu. The word implies that Musa wants to say the fire granted him comfort and intimacy. The word is distinct from the word first used to describe his seeing the fire in the third person, ra'a. Thus, while Musa is described as seeing a fire, he says he feels close and drawn to it. When Musa goes to the source of the fire, he finds closeness with God, and God even tells him his life story, verses 37 through 41. In addition, there is an intimacy in verses 12 through 14, because God uses the first person singular. Thus, Musa says he feels closeness from the fire, and he finds it there. And he says he might find guidance there, and he does. Not only does Musa find intimacy at the fire, but God also narrates intimate and tender details to him. So we've now jumped to verse 39. God mentions, I showered you with my love and planned that you should be reared under my watchful eye. The word translated as showered is alqaitu, from the root alqa, which is present a number of times in the surah and literally means to throw. The use of a verb with an immaterial object, love, is especially striking here because the same verb is used 7 times with a physical object in the surah and 1 other time with the immaterial. God tells Musa his life story, going back to when he was a baby. This is now, verse 40. And God inspired his mother to throw him in a basket in the water, ironically to protect him. Then God returned Musa to his mother so that she would rejoice and not grieve. That's verse 40. Thus, God has not only been watching over Musa, but God has also been watching over Musa's mother. And Musa does indeed use the plural, us, when he says to God in verse 35, you are always watching over us. At the end of telling Musa his life story, God says, verse 41, I have chosen you for myself. Again, a demonstration of Musa's words. When Musa is later before Fir'aun and the sorcerers, God tells Musa how to proceed, and thus God is watching over Musa then too. That's verses 68 through 69. In these examples, it is clear that the narrator is not only confirming Musa's words, but also refining them. I'm going to go to an earlier example now. Just as the narrator confirms Musa's expectations of the fire and what he will find there, the narrator also confirms Musa's words in his conversation with God. In the beginning of the conversation, God tells Musa that he is God. These are now verses 12 through 16. That he chose Musa, he should worship God, the hour is coming, and Musa should not be distracted from faith. Then God asks, verse 17, Moses, what is that in your right hand? Clearly, an omniscient God knows that Musa has his staff in his hand. Many of the surveyed commentators discuss why God asks this question. They say the question is here to bring attention to the miracles of the staff, to prepare Musa for what is to come, to draw Musa's attention to the staff, and to explicate its miraculous nature, or to show Musa the glory of what God can create. All of these commentaries assume that God is asking this question for Musa's sake. Musa responds to God's question in verse 18. "It is my staff," he said. "I lean on it, restrain my sheep with it. I also have other uses for it." He answers the question not only by identifying what is in his hand, but also by describing the purposes of the staff and saying that it has other purposes too. Quranic studies scholar Mustansir Mir writes about this dialogue. Moses, both surprised and delighted at the honor of being God's dialogue partner, is not content to provide a brief to the point answer, but dwells at some length on the subject of his beloved staff. The significance of the question, of course, is that God is about to demonstrate to Moses that his ordinary staff will serve as a miracle performing instrument, one that will aid him in performing his role as a prophet. Sayyid Qutb explains that the identity of the staff is obvious, so Musa answers the question by mentioning its uses. Some commentators explain that the other uses are other mundane uses, and they list them. At the same time, and this is, now you get a taste of the charming nature of commentary. At the same time, other commentators seem keen to mention special properties of the staff. It is the staff of Adam. It came from heaven and then was passed on through the prophets until Shu'aib gave it to Musa when he married his daughter. Or the name of the staff is Neba'ah, and some of its miracles are that it has a fork which becomes candles at night. If an enemy appeared, the staff would attack them, and it could even facilitate fruit ripening. One commentator also mentions the coming miracles of the staff. The staff becomes a snake. When Musa hits a rock with the staff, water gushes forth, and when he hits the river with it, it parts. Commentators mention extra special properties of the staff that are not mentioned in the Quran, and this may be a reflection of the fact that in his wording, Musa leaves room for the potential of the staff in verse 18 by saying, "I also have other uses for it." He presumably means that there are other things that he does with his staff that he has not mentioned. But his language indicates the potential of the staff, and the narrator confirms these words in the narrative. The narrator does not call the staff a staff, asa. It is as if God does not want to simplify its identity and its potential for so much more. Mebudi implies this. He writes, quote, "The command came, throw it down, O Moses. Throw down the staff concerning which you say that it is your staff." Moses threw it down and it became a snake. When he saw that the snake aimed to come after him, he was frightened and fled. The call came, "Take it and fear not. O Moses, pick up the snake and do not fear. This is that very staff of which you spoke, claiming it was your staff. O Moses, what do you have to do with making claims?" So that was Mebudi. Musa's staff becomes a snake and it defies Firaun. It is thus a sign of God. This potential use and identity of the staff is arguably the most important one, and one of which Musa is unaware. Similarly, the most important part of Musa's identity is his potential to be a prophet and not his identity as a person. The staff can be a metaphor for God's power to create change and to make things do as he wills, a metaphor that is relevant in a story in which other changes take place. And although Musa did not know all of the things his staff would do and represent, his words foreshadow them. I also have other uses for it. Thus, God shows Musa's words about his staff to be true throughout the story. While the narrator shows to be true what Musa says about his staff, he also shows to be true what Musa says about God guiding people. And now we're moving forward to Musa and Fir'aun's conversation with each other. So Musa is debating basically with Fir'aun. Fir'aun asks Musa about God, and Musa responds, verse 50, "Our Lord is he who gave everything its form, then gave it guidance." Commentators discuss what this verse means. One of the ideas is that God guides animals to food, drink, mates, and At-Tabari adds communal living. Another interpretation is that God gave every being creation and form, then facilitates a purpose for him or her. In a later verse, God confirms Musa's words by creating and then guiding people, by saying that God guided Adam. The story of Adam's creation can be found in a number of places in the Qur'an, but not in Surat Taha, which means that if we read the creation of Adam elsewhere, we would find a thread that leads us back here. Thus, we have an intertextual connection through a reference and an exemption. By not including the creation of Adam in this surah, but including Adam and his guidance, one is led to wonder about and look for it elsewhere. Another way that God the narrator confirms characters' speeches is by merging their words with God's. As we will see, this is when one person's speech in a dialogue merges into God's. The first example occurs in the same dialogue between Musa and Fir'aun. In the dialogue, so we're now moving to 51 through 57. In the dialogue, it is unclear if Musa, God, or somehow both respond to Fir'aun. At first, the dialogue goes back and forth, switching speakers with qala. Fir'aun asks Musa a question in verse 51, and Musa seems to be answering in 52. In the next few verses, there's a merging of Musa's and God's speech. In the beginning and end are Fir'aun's questions. So we start with 51. He said, "What about former generations?" 52. Moses said, "My Lord alone has knowledge of them, all in a record. My Lord does not err or forget. It was he who spread out the earth for you and traced roots in it. He sent down water from the sky. With that water, we bring forth every kind of plant. So eat and graze your cattle. There are truly signs in all this for people of understanding. From the earth we created you. Into it we shall return you. And from it we shall raise you a second time. We showed Pharaoh all our signs, but he denied them and refused to change. He said, 'Have you come to drive us from our land with your sorcery, Moses?'" The beginning of verse 53 discusses God in the third person, so this can be interpreted as Musa's speech. However, the verse switches to the first person plural and says, "With that water, we bring forth every kind of plant." And this can be interpreted to be God's speech, since God is the creator of everything. The next verse arguably could be Musa's speech, although "so eat and graze your cattle" sounds more like God's speech than Musa's. Even in this surah, there is an example of the command from God to eat, and it is similar to many other verses in the Qur'an. The next verses must be God's speech, as God is the creator, and he is asserting this in the first person. That's verse 55. And God shows Fir'aun his signs, verse 56. Mustansir Mir explains that this is a parenthetic observation. Not infrequently, dialogues contain parenthetic observations, tadmin. In this study, our focus is to understand the narrative force of these verses. Why is there a parenthetic observation here in the middle of this dialogue? What does it do for this dialogue, this story, and the larger beliefs that this text aims to impart on its readers? Clearly, it is difficult to determine where Musa's speech ends and God's begins, because they have melded completely. How better could the narrator confirm Musa's speech than to have it merge with God's? We can even see these mergers as times when characters are rewarded for their faith through the narrative style, through a narrative connection with God. At the same time, we could argue here that we also have a confirmation of God the character's speech. God said he was with Musa and Harun in verse 46, and he again shows this through the narrative style. We have seen one example of God's words merging with Musa's, and a number of examples in which God the narrator confirms the words of Musa, a person that God the character says he made for himself and is God's messenger. We can also find an example of God confirming the words of the magicians in the surah. So we're now moving to around 56. First, we glide seamlessly from God telling Musa to confront Fir'aun to Musa and Harun in dialogue with and challenging Fir'aun. God shows Fir'aun his signs in 56, which Fir'aun interprets as magic, and challenges Musa to see who can overcome the other, 57 through 58. They come together as arranged. Now we're on 60 through 66. Fir'aun's magicians throw their staffs and ropes, and they look like snakes. Musa is fearful, verses 67 through 68. God comforts him and says, verse 69, throw down what is in your right hand. It will swallow up what they have produced. They have only produced the tricks of a sorcerer, and a sorcerer will not prosper wherever he goes. As a result, the magicians throw themselves down in prostration and declare their faith in God. Verse 70. Fir'aun then threatens the sorcerers. Now we're on 71. Pharaoh said, how dare you believe in him before I have given you permission? This must be your master, the man who taught you witchcraft. I shall certainly cut off your alternate hands and feet, then crucify you on the trunks of palm trees. You will know for certain which of us has the fiercer and more lasting abqa in Arabic punishment. The magicians respond by asserting that God's reward is more lasting, using the same word that is in Fir'aun's threat, abqa. This is now verse 73. We believe in our Lord, hoping he may forgive us our sins and the sorcery that you forced us to practice. God is better and more lasting. Indeed, God confirms their words twice in later verses about the afterlife in this surah, verse 127. This is how we reward those who go too far and who do not believe in their Lord's revelations. The greatest and most enduring abqa punishment is in the hereafter. And again in 131, and do not gaze longingly at what we have given some of them to enjoy, the finery of this present life. We test them through this, but the provision of your Lord is better and more lasting, abqa. Thus, God confirms what the magicians say, that God's reward and punishment are everlasting, not Fir'aun's. The example of merging speech that we discussed earlier was about Musa. However, in one example, the narrator merges the speech of God and the magicians. As we saw, the magicians see and are convinced by Musa's message. They submit to his faith. Fir'aun questions the sorcerers acting without him having given permission first. He provides an explanation for what happened, that Musa in fact taught them sorcery and was thus able to overcome them. And even when he threatens to punish and crucify the magicians, verse 71, they are still adamant in their faith. Their speech glides into God's. So now we're looking at 72 through 76. They said, we shall never prefer you to the clear sign that has come to us, nor to him who created us. So decide whatever you will. You can only decide matters of this present life. We believe in our Lord, hoping he may forgive us our sins and the sorcery that you forced us to practice. God is better and more lasting. Hell will be the reward of those who return to their Lord as evildoers. There they will stay, neither living nor dying. But those who return to their Lord as believers with righteous deeds will be rewarded with the highest of ranks, gardens of lasting bliss, graced with flowing streams, and there they will stay. Such is the reward of those who purify themselves. While it is possible that this is entirely the sorcerer's speech, it seems to discuss their fate, implying that Fir'aun fulfilled his threat and God accepts them into heaven. Nowhere else is their fate clearly discussed in this iteration. In addition, verses 74 through 76 are very similar to other verses in the Qur'an in which God discusses heaven and hell. Thus, these verses appear to be a very subtle and gentle way to show that the sorcerers did indeed die, but that what is important and what should remain with the readers is not that Fir'aun had them tortured and killed, but that they found faith and reward from God. The last time Fir'aun speaks in this story is before the magicians do, in verse 71. So not only do the magicians get the last word, but they share it with God. Through this analysis, we've seen that when the narrator confirms good people's words, God shows their words to be true, while also rewarding people. A result of this is that when God repeatedly shows Musa's words to be true, God is simultaneously affirming his messenger and the trustworthiness of the message and messenger. When the narrator confirms people's words and merges them with his own, God shows that he is with people when they do good and are fulfilling his will. In the verses with an unclear identity of the speakers, we see a merging and a confirming of people's words, but at the same time, a mystery. This can humble readers while elevating characters. Finally, by merging characters' speeches with God's, God rewards good people with narrative unity with God, what I call narrative fanat. Fanat is a Sufi concept to describe a spiritual union with God. Through this analysis, we come to a richer understanding of Surat Taha and of Quranic narrative style. Narrative choices work to further beliefs about God and people's relationships with God and God's word. All of these narrative choices convey God's involvement in people's lives. God is literally with people, and God even speaks for, with, and to them. All of the examples are also subtle enough that the reader has to think and ask questions in order to notice them. These narrative techniques bring the audience closer to the text, to the characters, and to God, building consonants between them all. Disbelievers and idols hastily drown in the sea, while messengers and believers come out of the sea safely to enjoy everlasting narrative unity with God. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Alhassen, for this wonderful, rich talk. I would like to invite everyone in the audience to write questions out in the chat window, or since we're so few of us, you can even raise your hand and you can speak if you'd like. While you gather your thoughts, I can begin with a question. I have many of them, Dr. Alhassen, but I could perhaps begin with this one. I'm curious about what you would say about the question of the Quran as a genre, because what we have here are obviously multiple voices. The voices are being guided by some meta-narratological voice. They are, as you said, there's a sort of fana of the voices within God's voice. Can we speak more broadly then about what kind of genre the Quranic texts might be in view of these, what Bakhtin would call a heteroglossia within this one text? are you able to argue that there is one genre perhaps that's operative here through your analysis of intertextuality and these dialogues and ambiguities about the speaker and so on?
I think it's really genre defying. I mean, even the fact that you find the stories in bits and pieces throughout, I think, and it's almost as if it glories in being genre defying too. Like it, and by the way, when I first started this book, I didn't look at the whole surah. Like I would just look at the story within whichever surah it is. And my editors pushed me to look at the whole surah. And when I did, I found that there was so much interaction between the non-story part and the story part. So, you know, like the analogy of the orchestra or spider web, you know, with all these webs and interactions. I think I see the temptation to want to pin things down. And I myself, like I said, I started that way, but I think in some ways it does a disservice because it sort of tries to erase all those interconnections.
Yeah, I mean, what I wonder is if you can use your observations to construct a genre. It doesn't have to fit within, you know, let's say there's a novelistic genre and the genre of a short story, and the, you know, genre of a play and so on. But and as what you're saying, it seems to defy any of the existing genres of writing that we're familiar with in Western frameworks.
Mm-hmm.
But are you, I mean, if somebody were to ask you, I mean, yeah, what is the framework within which you would place the Quran, even if it's, you know, even if the Quran is the only instance of that genre, what would be the defining features of it? I mean, is there some certain key elements that hold it together as a composite text, as opposed to being fragmentary?
Well, I think, by the way, I feel like the idea of the Quran being fragmentary is a complete I don't know, misinterpretation, or it's a complete oversimplicity, you know. That's why I was saying it's like a web, it's all interacting with each other. Yeah, I mean,
so is it the fact of the intertextuality and interaction driven by some master narrator that would allow you to argue for its unity and its non-fragmentary nature, and therefore help you, you know, lay out some definitional components of a genre?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's clearly well composed. I mean, the interactions are just, and also it's not in this book, but my forthcoming one, I also look at interactions between the stories and legal verses too. So even those that seem so different, even those overlap, and even those interact with each other.
Right. Great. I would like to open this up to the audience. Does anyone have any comments or questions? I think people are still mulling over the, you know, the very rich talk you gave. Oh, here's one. Okay. This is from Fatime Muntaziri, who is one of our graduate students in Department of Middle Eastern Languages and Cultures. She writes, "Thanks for the wonderful talk. In addition to the orality of the Quran, do you take into account the compilation and the sequence of revelation of the text? Given that the story of Musa in Surat Taha was not probably revealed as a whole. How would you explain the repetitions and the understanding of the text by the audience?"
Let's see. So first of all, my analysis, should have spelled this out in the beginning. It's also a rhetorical analysis. Okay, so we're looking in a way at the end result, like here's the Quran, how it looks right now, and how it has looked for a long time. and has interacted with people, and people have interacted with it in this current version of it. So no, I don't look at the time and the sequence and things like that. I think that the Qur'an's interactions with people is really what I'm interested in, and how people respond to that text. Let me see if there's anything else here for me to respond to. Repetition, I look at, again, from a rhetorical perspective. So let's say, like I showed you guys in that chart here with the repetition. So yes, we see repetition. But by the way, part of what I do in the forthcoming book is when you look in detail, you see that it's actually a lot less repetition than you think. I think what happens is because, for example, let me see if I can move this so that I could see. Musa sees the fire. It's actually only 3 times, for example. But I think because it's 3 times and not, let's say, just once, I think it stands out in our minds. And so, like, that's part of, I guess, what repetition does is, even though the thing isn't repeated, it brings it back to mind. It's fresher in our minds. It's more present for us, even though it's not repeated as many times as we might have thought. Like if you ask me about how many times does Musa see the fire, I don't know. I think I might have thought it would have been more than that. I mean, 3 is not that many.
Great, thank you. We are open to other questions because we do have time. So when you were, Dr. Alhassen, when you were looking at these texts, one question that presents itself is, given the prevailing position on the nature of the Quran in Muslim theology, namely that it is eternal, do any of the commentators raise the question of quotations within the Quran? Because those are, of course, historically spoken. What is their status, and how do they explain the presence of quotations within an eternal text, those quotations themselves being reports about a historical moment? And does that complicate your thesis in any way?
That is a really great question, and I haven't looked in, like I've never thought about that or looked into it, but it's really funny to me. One thing that I have looked into is where there are quotations and they're different, you know, like, so because you have repetition, right? So if, let's say, the dialogue with Musa and Firaun, if we compared it to Surat Al-Qasas, I'm sure we're going to find differences. So I have looked into that. But in terms of the issue of, well, if the Quran is eternal, then how are the quotations there? So I haven't looked into that, but I should, because it sounds like a really interesting place to go.
I mentioned it because I did run into this discussion at some point, but it wasn't at that point. I didn't have time, nor was this a scholarly theme that I was pursuing. But you will find that discussion within both tafsir and the kalam material. And I'm curious about how that might or might not complicate your thesis about intertextuality and the melding of narrative voices within the voice of God. And so yeah, that might be an interesting avenue to research.
Yeah. And
I also have a student with whom I can put you in touch. She was looking at the possibility in early Hanafi legal theory of translations of the Quran in the course of prayer. Now, I don't remember the details exactly, but there was some issue about whether stories in the Quran, long narratives with reports about events, can be translated in the course of prayer, as opposed to other parts of the Quran that are not reports about historical events and not quotations and not stories. But if you wish to pursue that further, she has done some work on it. So, okay, with that aside, Yasmin Amin has a question. Please go ahead.
Let me read it first. I have a question.
Yes, I wrote it first, and then thank you very much, Leyla. It was really fascinating. And you mentioned that some stories are kind of divided into several surahs. And does this mean that every surah adds to the story, or do some surahs use the same story but from a different perspective? And did you encounter perhaps some contradictions in any of the, say, fragment stories compared to the meta narrative? For lack of a better word, I don't know what to call it.
Thank you. Yes, I would definitely argue that every surah adds to the story. So each iteration adds to it. So let me tell you, like, one of my favorite examples of this. And again, it's not in this book, it's in the next book. So the part where in the Quran, Musa he sees some people fighting and he wants to help. So he goes to help, and he hits the person, looks like intentionally, but accidentally kills him. And later on, it turns out, it seems that that person is a bit of a troublemaker anyways. So, I mean, that's another topic. Anyways, bottom line, he kills someone. And then he flees as a result of what he did. Because he's scared that he himself will be killed for what he did. So that story, I don't have the exact numbers right now, but I think it's 4 times we find that scene in the Quran, okay? And one of them is told where God is saying as a narrator that this happened. And then one of them is Musa, when he tells God that he's scared to go to Pharaoh, he gives this explanation. So he's saying in the first person what happened. And then the interesting one that I wanted to really get into is Pharaoh tells Musa about it. So and the wording is so great. He says, فعلت فعلتك التي فعلتها, something like that, with the فعل, فعلت فعلتك التي فعلتها. And so 3 times the فعل, and also it's like, so in English, the way I would translate it is, you did that deed that you did, you know, and this repetition, but then also the gall of Pharaoh to say, that deed, you know, like, it's so bad that I can't even say what you did. Whereas Pharaoh himself has been having people, you know, killed, babies killed. So, and even his wife, when she finds Musa as a baby, she says, don't kill him. So it's so clear that he's having people killed. But then when he's telling Musa about what Musa did and how Musa killed someone, he says it in this way where it's clearly manipulative. I mean, he's clearly manipulating, trying to manipulate Musa's emotions and to make him feel that he did something so terrible and he cannot move beyond what he did. He must stay in that same place. And so through the repetition, we get to see how manipulative Pharaoh is, because if we didn't have that, that version, we wouldn't have gotten all this complexity. You know, we would have just seen it as, okay, this is what happened. But when we get it through Pharaoh's mouth, then we see how he's, you know, trying to manipulate things and manipulate Musa also. I think you're on mute, Yasmin.
I'm sorry, and I'm sorry, my internet is atrocious. This is why I keep coming and going. But I mean, the camera. But what I wanted to ask really, are there any contradictions? Like, you know, for example, in one story, this is classified as white. And then in another story, it's not actually very white. It might be a little bit gray or whatever. This is what I, not just different perspectives, but contradictory perspectives.
Okay, so for that, I have another one example that I'm still thinking, like I'm still mulling over this one. It's actually the magicians. So the magicians, I forgot if it was in this example, they say that Fir'aun compelled them or forced them to do the magic that they did, okay? But in, I think it's Surat Al-Qasas, they say, they go to Fir'aun and they ask, is there a reward for us if we do our magic well? So to me, that seems contradictory, maybe, that, well, they look so eager on the one hand that they're even asking for a reward, but later on they're saying that they were forced into this. So I don't know, maybe from a psychological perspective, we could say maybe somebody could feel that they're compelled, but they could also be wanting a reward. But I don't know. Like I said, I'm still thinking about that one.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other thoughts or questions? I'll ask, I suppose we still have time, but if I could indulge in one more, Dr. Alhassen. I was wondering, I mean, and you've talked about this, but I would like you to elaborate on it further. I was wondering if you find these shifting voices in the Quran and stories being completed and the intertextuality, all of it, at the end of the day, as a means to drive the reader towards a kind of a curated, through a curated motion, into applying their readership capacities in deriving some kinds of conclusions. In other words, do you read the Quranic text itself, the matn of the Quran, as a kind of a subdued commentary, which through the hints and through the expressions and through the quotations is meant to lead the reader into sort of producing a plot, producing a whole? Is that an underlying technique here?
Are you asking, some of it was choppy, by the way, for me. Are you asking if, like, there are holes that the reader is sort of compelled to try to fill in?
Yes, pretty much that, right? Because I'm asking this question from my perspective of my work on commentaries, not in the Quran, but on philosophical genres. So what I've noticed is that an author, a matin, right, the person who writes the base text would give you an argument, but it might even be a half, fulfilling argument, or it might be an argument that's actually bad. It doesn't fulfill the point that the author is trying to make. And often, very much like the Quran, the author would say something like "fatadabbar" or "fata'ammal" or "fatadhakkar." And so, what you find in the commentaries, which are equivalent to sort of active readers, is that they would be led by that command to reflect to some other part of the text or some underlying story that the text is pointing to. In other words, the reader is an agent in the recreation of the story through these quotations and fragments and half-fulfilled promises of narration and so on. And is in that sense, the reader is sort of speaking and writing the text out, which is itself there, but it's almost as if the text in potentiality is guiding the hand of the reader as a writer, as a mufassir, giving it agency to do that, but at the same time sort of holding the hand and leading it through these different parts and producing a whole out of it. Is this a kind of phenomenon that you're noticing also in the Quran, or is this
I think definitely, yeah. And so, and I think you see that as a result in tafsir. So, in fact, it's funny, my first 2 chapters really go into that, the secrets and knowledge and our limited knowledge. So it definitely seems like information is not given, and the lack of provision of information is also deliberately pointed out. Like our lack of knowledge is also clear to us. And I think that's also part of the theological message that, well, God knows everything and we do not. God chooses to reveal whatever God chooses to reveal. And if God does not reveal something, then we do not know that. So, and you know, one thing people sometimes ask about is the names of people in the stories. You know, some names are there, but some are not there. And then in tafsir, though, you'll find the names and you'll find the lineage and you'll find their history, family history and things like that. So clearly commentators wanted to answer those questions. I also came across an interesting, like a slightly different kind of example is in a book by Michelle Kuipers on Surat Al-Maidah. So in Surat Al-Maidah, the disciples of Isa, they ask God to, well, they ask Isa if God can send them a table with a feast. And then the answer is that they will get a feast, but if they do not believe afterwards, they'll get the worst punishment that anyone has ever received. So I was interested in this story in terms of like, are they sinning by asking for this? Is this ask too big? And so, and what was interesting, and what I came across in commentary is some people felt like, yeah, their asking shows their lack of faith. And for specific linguistic reasons in terms of the way that they ask. But the interesting thing was in Kuiper's explanation, he says that actually it's not even clear in the end if they received the table or not. And some commentators actually say that when they heard that, they got scared. When they heard what the potential punishment would be, they got scared. So they withdrew their request. And then there, Kuiper says, the Quran leaves it to the reader to decide or to think about, to actively be part of this reading process. And even, I guess, in this case, the story, how you want to think about the story. Did they get the table? Did they not get the table? Did they believe? Did they not believe? Were they believers in the first place or were they not? Like, this is all for us to think about.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for giving us this rich, enlightening talk. I enjoyed it very much, and I know the audience did as well. And we look forward to your return. For everyone who's here, Dr. Alhassen will give another talk in the spring. And so we're looking forward to welcoming you again. Thank you again for joining us.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you for the questions too.
Bye.